Hello, hello. Hope my voice holds out. Um, you can see that this chapter is unusual in my approach to it. And yeah, that's because I've taught this course a bunch of times. And normally for this chapter, I can drag in real equipment and put it under the document camera and show you how it works and everything. Here, I have to try to talk you through it. So, with that in mind, here's the beginning of chapter 7, and we've already seen a bit of this in the Guthrie lecture, and it says we're turning a corner, and we're turning a corner. Um, the last paragraph here is salient, and again, it speaks to the history of the author and myself. This was definitely true when I was in grad school. Operant conditioning is usually discussed as if it were completely independent of classical conditioning, and the chapter is sticking with that tradition, but it ain't necessarily so. Not important for what we're dealing with here. And all these types of learning, SOs and ROs, and the idea of reinforcers, and here comes contiguity theory again. Uh, I love, I used to not like the way the book bounced around, but now I see the wisdom in it. He really is making a review for the final. Edward Thorndike and his puzzle boxes, cats having to get out of more and more complex boxes to both get out of the box and get food. Um, and he believed in reinforcement theory, and I talked about stamping in. There it is down there, stamped in the SR association. Whether things could be stamped out was a little bit more confusing. And as I mentioned, I'm still afraid of Clark Hull and his mathematics. And there's our good friend Guthrie, and you've seen that lecture. Um, and the important concept here is the concept of stimulus elements, which can be due both to changes in the environment and changes in the organism. And again, I used white and black balls, and he uses mustard and blue balls. Hopefully, this makes more sense now than when we first passed through it. Stimulus sampling theory is very important. Um, that flank rubbing, if you've been around cats, you know that that's what they do. Um, so apparently, some basically built-in behaviors can make trouble for your research, and that's a nice little discussion of that there. Um, the Tolman, one of my mature faculty in graduate school, had been a student of Tolman. Tolman was pretty darn impressive, and he had photographic memory, and was fluent in German too. And he did a number of classic research studies, some of which bothered Skinner because they seemed a bit cognitive. And the designs of those are on this page. This round thing on the left is a tabletop, and then this is the path to the goal. And then you get this starburst design with the same tabletop, but you block off the exit that had been there before. That was very clever. And there's a plus maze. Those are popular. These are often elevated off the floor, or else they're the rats would just step off them and walk on the floor. Uh, so you can, make them based on responses or locations. And as the book points out, locations are better. And there's a very complex one where the animals, one group of animals is not reinforced, and then another group is not reinforced, and then suddenly they are. And then the red group is reinforced throughout. And you can see clear evidence that the non reinforced group, who is suddenly reinforced, is learning something because, bam, they have a reason to get somewhere and they get there. So that was clever. That's Tolman. The concept of learning versus performance, that's important. It's also important for memory. You can't demonstrate your memory. We don't know if you've learned it. And then there's latent memory. Yes. So this is a good little discussion. But the meat of the chapter for me is this operant stuff. This is where I would bring in the tech, and I'm going to ask you to understand the tech, the tech. So Skinner was very clever. His doctoral dissertation was a book, and he was very good in the lab. He designed things, he invented things, and that played a major role in his research, which, if I were teaching you from near my office, I'd bring in one of his books and I'd show you some of his earlier designs. They're very clever. And one of those books used to be online, but they took it down. So I can't show you that. And food pellets are going to be important in this chapter. And in a little bit, we'll come back to that. Superstitious behaviors. We see this a lot in sports. And rats and pigeons, and it's not the reinforcement is not contingent on the superstitious behavior, but the animal begins to behave as if it is. Stimulus control. I'm not going to spend much time talking about this, but the latter part of the chapter talks about that. The concept of fading. I usually miss this when I gave these lectures live, but Terrace is here, and Terrace is trying to teach, I believe, pigeons, yes, because it's color, horizontal, vertical discrimination, like do one thing to horizontal, do another thing to vertical. And pigeons just aren't very good at that out of the box, but they're good at colors. So Terrace would overlay the pattern on the color and get the animal to respond to the color and then fade the color out. And finally, the animals were responding quite well to the patterns. Very clever. We'll come back to that in another chapter. SDs and S deltas are used throughout the chapter. You should become familiar with those symbols so you don't have to think about it when they come out. And condition reinforcement is very important. And of course, this is one of the ways that operant conditioning links to classical conditioning. And there's a discussion of primary and secondary or conditioned reinforcers. And that's all very good. And conditioned reinforcers are used in many settings. There used to be a television program where this British woman would teach you how to train your dog, and she would run around with a hand clicker. It just goes click, click. And when the dog did something that she liked, she would click it, and clicks were associated with food reinforcement. But you could deliver, if you threw food at the dog, they would stop and eat the food. But with the clicker, they would keep on going. And there was a surgeon who took this technique and was teaching medical students how to tie knots using it. So rather than talking and intervening and sticking your finger into the knot, he would click. And it also showed a great improvement in learning of the knot training. And there's the clicker training down below. And behavioral chains. Chain is a good word because it has links and you have to go through the chain to get to the end. And there's um, an example of a chain. And conditioned reinforcement can be very important to chains, and chains are important to complex behaviors often. Um, and now we're getting to schedules of reinforcement, which is where we're going to start doing the technology. Hopefully, we'll be hitting the picture of the Skinner box here shortly. Um, Continuous reinforcement, that's often how we start out. In other words, the animal just has to do, or the person just has to do one thing, and you get your reinforcement. And this reminds me of grade school, where if you could get a letter between two lines, you got a gold star. And I love those stars, and I love the turkeys and pumpkins. And we started off with a very rich schedule of reinforcement, approaching 100%, which would be continuous reinforcement. And now we're getting there. So Skinner uh, in the 50s, here we go. These are some of the worst graphs I've ever seen for Skinner boxes and cumulative recorders. They are almost uninterpretable. Um, but that thing on the left, the cumulative recorder, might make you think of something I obsessed over in an earlier lecture that Pavlov used. Now, Pavlov did his stuff before electricity could help things, and Skinner had the blessing of electricity, so he didn't have to worry about having very delicate devices. But you may recognize this as looking a bit like a kymograph, and it is, except here, this is so bad. This is a roll of paper, and you never draw on the paper. There's usually an aluminum cylinder that you draw on, and you roll paper off the paper roll, sort of like a typewriter. But it is true that there are often two pens. One can move up the paper, and one is not movable up the paper, but it has a solenoid on it. My first lecture in grade school was on our friend, the doorbell. Now, in my day, doorbells had solenoids, and solenoids were coils of wire that, when electrified, became magnetic, and they would pull the cylinder, and there'd be a rubber stop around one end, and it would hit a chime, and you get ding, and then you'd let go of the doorbell, and the spring that ran that cylinder would go back, and you'd get dong. And I gave my first lecture on a solenoid. So those tick marks in that figure on the bottom, those are caused by solenoids, coils of wire, magnets, and a pen that moves, and they can record events. In this case, they seem to be indicating when the animal gets a reinforcement. More traditionally, there's a solenoid connected to the mobile pen, and you get a tick mark up here to see where the reinforcement is delivered, and that's the way we'll deal with it in this lecture. Then what's this down here for? Well, it very well could be for our good friends, the SD and S delta, Q lights and stuff, or conditions that the animal is in, to see whether those conditions affect behavior. And then over on the right, you get your cumulative record, and for reasons that are inexplicable, you lose a pen. And you can see how relatively useless the red line is without that pen. All right, so that's garbage. Let's look at my links. Okay, so again, I obsess over Skinner, and we've seen this before. Here's this house on North Washington Avenue. Very nice corner lot. Senator Casey, Senator of Pennsylvania, his house is a little bit up the street, across the street. And our president's house, Joe Biden's house, is a few blocks up the street on the right. It's not nearly as impressive as this house. Skinner lived here after his dad got a really good job as a lawyer for a railroad company. So there's that one. And you want to see a nice house. Holy moly. So you may have to be on Facebook to see this. But if you move away from Biden's house toward the more affluent area of Greenridge Street, this house is on a corner. It is amazing. 1701 North Washington Avenue. It is spectacular. So, bidding starts at $1 million if you're interested in the epitome of authentic craftsmanship and artistry. 8 working fireplaces, hand carved, Louis the 14th marble and Louis the 14th red marble. It's just crazy good. So the Greenridge section of Scranton had some pretty amazing people in it. B.F. Skinner, Senator Casey, Joe Biden, and by luck, I ended up living there for a bit myself, and my grandma. Okay, and again, remember the sad. There's Skinner's brother's grave, and he died young, apparently playing basketball. Okay, here's a figure you've seen, Pavlov. And the drool, the paddle, the little accordions that compress the air goes through the tube, the air expands the accordion and moves the needle, and there's the kymograph. So Skinner's education overlapped with that, but by the time Skinner came along, he could go better than that. Remember, that thing ran on a clock motor. You had to wind it up, and you didn't write on it. You scratched soot off of it, and then you had to lacquer it. It was pretty much a nightmare. And here's a picture of it. And now this one is nice because it has 2 pens, which we'll be seeing quite a bit of. And again, the clock motor would be down here. Rotate the drum. The drum has a single piece of paper on it. One of these pens is the event pen, and the other pen may be like a time base. But if nothing happens, you just get 2 straight lines. That's very important to remember. If nothing happens, the clock motor does not stop. It keeps going, and you get straight lines. That's really important to understanding where we're going. And here we go. Okay, so this is a cumulative recorder from the top. This is the aluminum cylinder I mentioned. This is paper that's being pulled off of a drum that you can sort of see down in the bottom. There's tons of paper on there. You could probably run this thing for a month on that paper. There's a little roller here to keep things tight. All right, this is not the best picture. It only has 1 pen. It should have 2, but that's a solenoid. And so you can see the wires running to it. And you can see there's a little clip down here. It's actually a fuse clip. And in there would go originally a little glass pen, hand blown, incredibly expensive, and there would be ink in there, and that pen would not float, but it would touch the paper. The paper had to be very dense because if the ink from the pen worked its way through the paper, it would have put a hole in the paper, and that would be the end of data collection for that day. Okay, now let's look at these two things here. Again, I'm not in love with this. This has like a gear chain. I'm more familiar with things that look like old drain chains or the plunger in an old sink with all those little balls. But it's basically the same. So this wheel here has a spring connected to it. And as this chain moves up, the spring gets wound tighter and tighter, not threateningly tight, but tighter and tighter. So every time the animal responds, typically, this top wheel moves one step. So in this machine, we now have two motors. We have a stepper motor, which is the motor that steps this wheel. And usually every response gets you one step. And then this paper is driven by a clock motor. Clocks used to have motors, and they would whir and they would just creep along very slowly. So this clock motor down here would continuously drag the paper underneath the pen that's on this clip. And every time the animal responded, this chain would pull up and up and up, and the pen would go up and write higher and higher on the page. But of course, the page keeps moving, so you get a diagonal line. And every time the animal gains a reinforcement, typically this solenoid would be electrified. This would pull down and then release, and you get a tick mark. Well, it can't go forever. I mean, the paper is only so wide. So this step motor up here has a trigger. And when the pen gets, say, about to here, because if you let it run off the paper, you're dead. When it gets about to here, a micro switch, and a micro switch is a small switch. Now, when these things were made, micro switches were laughably big, but the micro switch would switch, and this wheel had a clutch, and the micro switch would cause the clutch to release, which meant the stepper motor couldn't do anything anymore, and this was free to move. And don't forget that this wheel has a spring winding up. So the second this thing releases, this spring winds it back, zip, basically straight down the page until another micro switch tells the system, it's back. And when the second micro switch knows it's back, this clutch re-engages. So you get a diagonal line up the page often. The micro switch on the stepper motor engages, releases the clutch. The pen goes straight down the page, too fast, basically for almost any behavior or reinforcement. Then the micro switch associated with this wheel engages everything, and it just keeps going. This will make more sense as we see the product of this design. B.F. Skinner, by the way, invented this, and there was actually a company that he was involved with that marketed these things. And again, if we were in the department, I would go to the display case and I'd get this baby out for you. Okay. Now, here's the cumulative recorder in action. This has 2 pens. Whoops. Whoops. In action. That did not go as planned. I thought that was a video. Oh no. It's an image. You can't see the image. I'll have to try to fix that. Actually, I want to see it now. Okie doke. So this cumulative recorder is much, much, much more like the one I would have brought into class. Let's review. There's a solenoid here, which this pen doesn't move, but it can tick. There's the solenoid we saw in the first picture that can go up the page. Here are those very delicate, very expensive glass pens. One of them recording the animal's behavior as this stepper motor steps. And then this other one, see these, they seem to be recording reinforcements here too. But notice this area where it goes down, stays down and goes up. That's a change in condition. Could be an SD and S delta. Here's the paper streaming off the top. There's the stainless steel drum again. There's the roller that holds things tight. Down below here is the infinite supply, functionally infinite supply paper. Here's the chain I talked about, like on old drains. This stepper motor, you can't really see it in the picture, but it has a wand coming off of it, which will hit this little vertical piece here, which is the micro switch, which will disengage the clutch. This will zip it back down. Another micro switch will be activated, and it all starts again. So you can see the reset here, the F, straight down the page. And you can see the reinforcement slashes and the pattern of behavior. Skinner was very proud of himself, appropriately so. This over here is part of the clock motor that makes the paper go. So this is a very clever design. Yes, Ralph Cabrand's company. That's what we have in our display case. Let's see if there's anything else interesting here. Those pens are a nightmare. If they clog, they're very difficult to unclog. You could always tell people running with Skinner boxes because these would have red ink on them, in them, and you'd often have to suck them to clear them, and then you would be red for the rest of the day. Okay, so I promise I'll try to fix that. And here's the video. No. Here's the video. Took a long. Okay, I apologize for the noise, but it's real life. And again, you can see this is the one with the chain, the one I'm more familiar with. There's your paper. In the modern era, which I never lived in, those nightmarish glass pens were replaced with felt tip pens. And you can see a cumulative record. When the animal takes a break, you get a flat line. When reinforcements are delivered, you get reinforcement slashes because of the solenoid that's connected to the pen. Let's run this some more. I apologize for the noise. That was a reinforcement slash. Those are responses. There's a reinforcement flash. Responses, reinforcement flash. When I was you, uh, we all got our own rat, and we had to train them. We didn't have our own cumulative recorder; that was too expensive. One nice thing about this shot is down this brown thing. That's a trap door. When you open it, there's a huge roll of paper in there, and these are the gears that drive uh, the aluminum cylinder that moves the paper. You can obviously change the gears if you want to make it run faster or slower. So that was nice. First year I've ever been able to find a good video. Okay, now remember Skinner was inventing all this stuff, and he had to feed his rats. He had to reinforce them. He had to give them reinforcement pellets. Nowadays, you just go to the store and you buy reinforcement, not the store, but you order them online, reinforcement pellets. If you've ever seen It's a Wonderful Life, Jimmy Stewart, the old pharmacist, the apothecary, old pharmacists were always making pills. They would grind stuff up and they'd put it together, and then they would literally make pills. And Skinner had to steal that technology to reinforce the behavior of his rats. And this is the kind of thing he had to use. Yeah. Okay. So that's brass, and it's called fluted brass because it's fluted. And you can see there's fluting down here, and there's fluting up here. And what do? You make a paste of your pill material, and you can sort of imagine it being like peanut butter. And you slather it down here, and then you put this on top, and you slide it back and forth, and a miracle happens. Your slathered peanut butter turns into little round pills, and they collect down here. But they're little round pills of wet peanut butter. And you can't put them into your equipment because they'll gum it up. So to make pills, Skinner would have to grind up rat food, which took a while. And I've tried to do that. It ain't easy. You could buy rat food from a distributor at that time. You'd grind it up, you'd wet it up, you'd make it into a mash, you'd put it in this device, you'd slide it back and forth, you'd make these little pills, but they were wet. And then you would put them out on wax paper or something, and they'd often have to dry for a day or two before they were dry enough to safely use in your equipment. That was a lot of work. And I've read a lot of Skinner's original research. And as he tells the story, it was a sunny Saturday afternoon at Harvard, and he was running rats and applying basic elements of mathematics. He realized that if he didn't start making pills right then, his rats were going to eat all of his pills by Monday morning. Now, at that time, the animals were on a cumulative reinforcement schedule, a continuous reinforcement schedule. Every time they did what he wanted them to do, they got a pill. And Skinner, in a stroke of brilliance and laziness and wanting to go outside and play, he said, "Well, geez, why do the rats have to get a pellet for every response? Why not make them do it a couple times and then give them a pellet?" And the partial reinforcement schedule was invented. And I want you to know, based on this lecture, what the first partial reinforcement schedule was. And we'll get to that in a bit. Okay, so pill rolling machine. Nowadays, you can get them from a supplier. Here's a Skinner box and feeder. By the way, there's Skinner and his wife and his daughter, and he invented something called an air crib, which I may show you later in the semester. I really wanted to put my first daughter in an air crib, but my wife was not amused. She turned out quite well, for both my daughter and Skinner's first daughter. Okay, so down below on the left, you have the real deal. Although there's a lie. It says Purina Rat Chow. No, those are specialized food pellets for operant chambers, and I don't think Purina made them. Um, but on the right, there they are, a pellet dispenser. And there's bars in case you want to shock the animal. We'll talk about that later. There's a response key, which you had better make very robust. That's stainless steel. When I was I was a student. We had aluminum uh, response levers, and the rats would treat them like food and eat right through them. Um, and then there are signal lights. Now they're colored, which is not a good cue for a rat, but left and right they can deal with. So you could have an SD and an S delta and a speaker if you wanted to add that. Um, when I was a child, many kids would have these gumball machines. You get them for Christmas, and it was a round ball, and you put gumballs in there, and you put a penny in there, and you'd slide it, and the slider would let one ball drop out at a time. That's basically the pellet dispenser. So you put a gazillion pellets in there, like they're so small, they're much smaller than a pea. And there's a disc on the bottom of the dispenser with a lot of little holes in it. The pellets drop into the holes and roll around. And when you want to deliver reinforcement, the wheel goes ka-chunk, it moves forward, and the next pellet drops into you can kind of see it here, a plastic tube. It rolls down here into the pellet dispenser, and the rat is very happy. Pigeons, of course, their boxes are very different than this. There, you're bringing a tray of grain up to them, but that's a good box. Uh, so I like that figure. I've never used that one before either. And Skinner with his tech. This this guy had a giant head. It was like a light bulb. Uh, so there's the pellet dispenser. He's touching it on the right. You can see the tube very nicely here, and it's filled with these little pellets, which Skinner doesn't have to make by hand anymore. And remember, he invented partial reinforcement schedules because he wanted to go outside and play. There's Gabran's cumulative recorder, which you're now familiar with. There's the rat hard at work, not an albino. What's all this stuff in the back? I worked with that stuff. That's how we used to program things before modern computers. We had wires and snap leads and timers. Oh man, uh, that's how I learned to program, and that controls how many responses the animal has to give, or what time a reinforcement is available, and for how long uh, the pellet dispenser triggers, and it also controls the marks on the cumulative recorder. That was a beast. But look at that guy's forehead. Whoa, smart dude. Um, okay, now I said that Skinner invented partial reinforcement schedules because he wanted to go outside and play. So he's in his lab, and he's very clever, and he's got a well-stocked lab. And he says, "Why do I have to give these animals a pellet every time?" So he goes into the lab and he finds a mechanical timer. And a mechanical timer is a clock motor like the one that drives the paper, which has a cam that goes around and closes a micro switch, which we've already discussed. And he wired that into a circuit. So when the rat hits the lever, it gets a pellet, but it starts this timer. And the timer he picked up had stamped on it 1 minute timer. Okay, so this is important. You must know this. The first partial reinforcement schedule was a fixed interval, 1 minute. And while that timer was running, that animal could hit the lever all it wanted and nothing would happen except the human recorder would record things. But the animal doesn't know that. So the timer times, the animal hits the lever, no pellets, no pellets, no pellets. Finally, the timer trips the micro switch at the end of its travel. The timer stops, and the circuitry sets up so that the next time the animal hits the lever, bam, gets a pellet, gets a reinforcement slash, and the timer starts again. And no reinforcements are possible while the timer is timing. Okay, so you know I love 2x2 tables. This is a partial reinforcement schedule. This is the first partial reinforcement schedule. It's a fixed interval because it's an interval that's fixed, and it's an FI 1 minute. So 2x2 table. Now, unfortunately, they put the fixed interval down here. So it's an interval schedule. It's fixed. Reinforces the first response after a constant amount of time. And what was the first partial reinforcement schedule? FI1, fixed interval 1. Well, with clever programming, which is very difficult back in the day of wires and snap leads, but is very easy with computers, you could have a VI 1 minute schedule. A VI 1 minute schedule is a variable interval 1 minute schedule, which means that on average, once a minute, the animal gets a pellet. But it's only an average. So the animal gets a pellet and it doesn't know. The next time it hits the lever, it could get a pellet. It may be 30 seconds before it gets a pellet. It may be 2 minutes before it gets a pellet. It doesn't know. It's variable. Now try to think about how you would respond on a VI 1 minute schedule. So you can have an FI 1 minute. Think about how to respond on that. You can have a VI 1 minute. Think about how to respond on that. Now, I'll tell you, the man, capitalism, is not a fan of these schedules. They like ratio schedules. They like piecework. They like pounding out things and getting salary based on work output. You can have a fixed ratio schedule. The animal in that video, I don't know, that might have been an FR5, fixed ratio 5. So you set it up so the first response, no pellet, second, no pellet, third, no pellet, fourth, no pellet. But now the equipment is set so that when you do the fifth response, you get your tick mark, you get your pellet, and then you reset the counter. Fixed ratio 5. You could have 5, you could have 10s. I've worked with 50s. And of course, capitalism loves you to work a ton for very little reinforcement. And in fact, in an operant chamber, you can make the rat work harder for the pellet than the calories it delivers. Then there's also variable interval schedules. If you can have an FR5, you can have a VR5. So the animal hits the lever, they get a pellet. On a variable ratio, you get a pellet for the next response. Or you may have to wait 4, and then you get a pellet. And then you may have to wait 10, and then you get a pellet. It's variable. Now, what does that make you think of in real life? Hunting, fishing, dating, science, sports. Real life isn't gambling, but gambling. Variable ratio schedules are really powerful. They can literally be considered addictive. How do you respond on them? How do gamblers respond on the VR partial reinforcement schedules? Okay, so there we go. 2x2 table. You got to know all 4. You have to be able to describe them in English. You have to understand the initials. You have to know that the FI 1 minute was the first. And you have to be able to describe how animals behave on them. And that's what we're about to do next. So here's some typical behavior. This is not brilliant, but it's not awful. Notice the slopes. The steeper the slopes, the harder the animal is working. Why does capitalism love ratio schedules? Because your workers work really, really hard. 16 tons, and what do you get? Another day older and deeper in debt. Coal mines used to make you fill a coal car to get your money. But if the coal settled as the car was being dragged out of the mine and it didn't hit a stick at the top, you didn't get full credit. Pretty evil. So here's fixed ratio on the left, variable ratio on the right. One thing I would say is that usually variable ratio slopes are steeper. But notice that the fixed ratio pattern is fixed. That's probably about a, what is it? Maybe a 25, FR25. And then on the right, that could be an FR25 too. But you never know when you're going to get your next pellet. And then the next one is fixed interval. Remember, FI1 is the first. And there, your tick marks don't line up with responses. They line up with time. Yeah, that's a long interval. So the animal is well trained on this. Obviously, they know what's going on. This is a bit like looking for the mail. If you look for the mail and it's there, you do not go back to the mailbox. You just hang out. And as you're waiting for the mail the next day, you look out at the mailbox more and more and more and more, and oh, the mail's there. And then you don't look at the mail again. So this pattern of responding is very characteristic of FI1, of FI schedules. It's called scallops. And there's a scalloping pattern on some knives that looks a bit like this. It's a bit like a wave. You get a reinforcement slash, you don't do much, and then you go faster and faster. And by the way, at the end of this, you may be going virtually as fast as ratio schedules, and then you get your pellet, and then you slow down and go back up. Now, the VI schedule is interesting, and it's used a lot in research. Not much of a pattern there. The pellets come variably, but the animal's behavior is very stable. Can you explain why that is? Well, this is why capitalism doesn't like the schedule. Is there any benefit to going faster? If you're on a ratio schedule and you double your response rate, you get twice as many reinforcements. If you pound out 20 responses faster, you get your next pellet faster. Ratio schedules, the rate of responding is tied to the rate of reinforcement, not intervals. And here, there's a steep slope, so there's a lot of responding, but there's also a lot of dead time. Variable interval schedule, the animal's in there just chilling out. And they tap the lever, they tap the lever, they tap the lever, they get a pellet. And you never know, I may get another pellet, so I tap the lever, I tap the lever. That's very important. And variable interval schedules are used a lot in research. And you're going to largely end up reading this section. When you get to the matching part of the chapter, you'll see that they use variable interval schedules pretty extensively. So you must know the 2x2, you must know the 4 schedules, you must be able to describe them in English, you must know that the first schedule was an FI 1 minute, and you must be able to describe the pattern of responding that the animals exhibit. One last thing. You may be able to see that after some of these reinforcements, there's a little flat spot. Now, there's no really good reason for that, because if the animal isn't hitting the lever, they're not accumulating responses, and that will delay reinforcement, but they still do it. Those little flat spots are called PRPs, post reinforcement pauses. This is all testable. Know this stuff. PRPs, post reinforcement pauses. Sometimes you don't get them, sometimes you do. What happens is the animal stops for a while and then goes back to work at what we call the final terminal rate. There's no scalloping. They just go from nothing to final terminal rate. Why is this interesting? This demonstrates what we call ratio strain. That's an animal's way of telling you this schedule is getting to me. I'm not loving it. I don't want to go back to work, but when I do, I do. Why is this important? What do you do after a quiz, after an exam? Do you go right back to studying? No. You go into a post reinforcement pause. And that means you're stressed. And one of my friends did a study on this, and it was with pigeons. And in the pigeon enclosure in the back was a stuffed pigeon on a little spring loaded platform. And it was a stuffed pigeon. He paid for it to be taxidermied. And he put pigeons on a fixed ratio until they started showing PRPs, and he wanted to know what they were doing. What they did was they went to the back of the enclosure and they beat the heck out of that poor stuffed pigeon. They really, really thumped it. And if you want to hurt another pigeon, what do you think you peck at? The eyes. Now, the eyes in the stuffed pigeon were glass, but these pigeons would peck the eyes, and the peck would glance off the glass eye and hit the feathers around it, and the glass eyes soon had donuts of no hair around them, and they still kept beating on them. And one day he went in, and the pigeon had knocked the head off the stuffed pigeon. It was just a wire sticking up out of a body, and they kept beating on them. So anyone who gives you the idea that positive reinforcement is all happy face and no stress is mistaken. And these frustrations can be taken out on spouses and pets and coworkers and violence against others. Society has to be very concerned with this. And I'm sorry that you're on a reinforcement schedule that generates some frustration. Okay. And here are the behavior. We did this one, right? Okay. So back to the book. Now we're going to blow through the rest of this chapter because I've really done the extra stuff I do every year on the technology of it. Because if you don't understand the technology, you really can't understand the graphs. And this is almost useless. It's less than useful. And there's cumulative record, cumulative recorder. There's the 4 schedules of reinforcement. And there's some scalloping there. It's not very beautiful. FI1, don't forget FI1. Variable ratio, nice and steady. Fixed ratio, there's a post-reinforcement pause, some indication of ratio strain, PRP, ratio strain, and variable ratio, which does have a slightly higher slope. Notice that there are no PRPs there. Should society worry about gambling? I vote yes. I used to shop on my way home at Turkey Hill, and it would just pain me to watch people buy lottery tickets, and while the little kid was hanging on to mom or dad, asking for candy or something they wanted, and the parent was buying lottery tickets. Um, yeah, lottery tickets is reverse taxation. Poor people do that more than rich people, and overall they lose money. If they didn't lose money, the state wouldn't run it. slot machines, casinos. I only know one person who was able to run casinos into the ground. Those are money-making machines. Uh, and I love it on Facebook when I see a picture of a happy person at the local casino who just ran won $2,000, and then they have to put in a link to gamblers, to people getting help for gambling. Society should worry about gambling. Uh, it's it's fun if you're into it, and it can ruin your life if you're not careful. So then they're talking about schedules. Um, and oh, FI 1 minute. Uh, and there's a truism. If you're on an FI 1 minute, how many pellets can you get an hour? Well, 60. It's 1 minute. VI 1 minute. How many are you going to get? On average, 60 because it's variable. Boy, I had a great book by Catania back in the day. He's a great guy. So there's a discussion of schedules, and then we have compound schedules where there's more than one schedule involved in the schedule, and chain schedules. You can have SDs and S deltas and chain schedules um, where you have to do this, and then you have to do that, and then you have to do the next thing. And Catania schedules of reinforcement. Uh, First and Skinner, I have that somewhere. Uh, it's just loaded with uh, cumulative records. You really have to understand cumulative records to understand this particular part of the field. Choice is very important, and you live in a world of choice. You're making choices all the time, like should I continue with this lecture or come back to it later? Concurrent schedules, very important. The book does an excellent discussion of them, uh, and they're very important. And they often use VI schedules. Oh, there we go. Concurrent VI schedules. Pigeons are popular here. Why? Rats don't live long. And to get the animal well trained, it can often take weeks or months. Pigeons have a long lifespan, and that's one of the reasons they're popular. They also have excellent vision and excellent color vision, so they're used a lot in these. In their world, they don't have levers. They have usually plastic discs to peck at, and they don't have pellet dispensers. They have a little trough that is on a solenoid, and you'll recall that's wire around a metal rod that can be electrified. And when electrified, that drags the food hopper up, and the pigeon says, "Oh boy," and goes to the hopper and can eat grain for a few seconds, and then it goes away, and then it has to go back to work. So VI schedules are popular here. Uh, why? Because they're useful for research. Um, do they exist in the real world? Sure, but the other schedules I think are often more important. And you've got B1 and B2, two different behaviors, and there's little bits of algebra here to look at. Um, and the, the way they match behavior to reinforcement is really extremely good. Uh, Only once in my life have I ever gotten data where the data points basically touched the diagonal line, and I wasn't doing behavior. I was dropping steel balls onto an accelerometer. On the left, you have two keys, different schedules, and you can do either one. On the right, you have one that you respond on, and the other one where you say, "Oh, I've had enough of that one. Let me have the other one." And this is Herrnstein, 71, the year I went to grad school. So there's the matching law, and Herrnstein was big on this. And then it's simplified over here. Behavior one, behavior two, reinforcement one, reinforcement two. Um, Makes good sense. And there's humans. Uh, we tried to put the chairman of our department on a reinforcement schedule as he was lecturing to us. It worked. We never told him because that guy was vindictive. But it was fun to do. We had a huge classroom with like 100 and some people in it, and we discovered something he liked, and we shaped him to standing over by a garbage can and eventually putting his foot up on it. It was fun. So humans do it, pigeons do it, and value the reinforcements are important. And melioration, I think that term came up earlier in the chapter. It's a way of explaining how matching uh, might occur. There's Herrnstein. He looks nice. Never met him. Choices everywhere. Uh, you can do this. You can do something else. And there's the quantitative law of effect, Herrnstein, 1970, and deals with reward rates. And there's Kataria again. Some very famous names here. And again, these are amazing data where it's not a straight line, but the best fit line basically touches the dots. This is the way operant research was typically done. We didn't use statistics. Skinner hated statistics. Skinner thought if you had to use statistics, you weren't controlling the situation well enough. So what you would do is you would take a bunch of animals, get cumulative records for them, and publish the cumulative record. And these aren't cumulative records, but they are graphs of pigeon behavior across different reinforcements per hour. And again, you can see VI schedules. Um, Pretty brilliant. And here we are at the end of the chapter. And some notes here for therapists. Giving people choices can help with maladaptive behaviors. And we're going to get to this later when we get to punishment. If animals have no choice, people have no choice, they're going to engage in maladaptive behaviors almost no matter what you do to them. But if you give, Bill Gates is not going to be stealing hubcaps on his way home. He has lots of ways to make money. Other behaviors are important, and society should really worry about those because there are other behaviors that are good for society, and some behaviors are not. And society should worry about its citizens and worry about them being happy. It's right in some of our founding documents. Pursuit of happiness. Go for it. So that's it for this week.